So welcome everyone to our May EES Spotlight lecture. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our members all over the world that make these lectures possible. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to put on this program of free events. If you're not yet a member of the Egypt Exploration Society, then please do consider becoming a member and head over to our website and join today. As I said, this is our final spotlight lecture for this theme, which has been exploring Egypt's independence. And I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Juliette Desplat, who is the head of modern collections at the National Archives. And she's a specialist in 19th and 20th century Middle Eastern history, particularly in the development of national identities, international boundaries, and colonial ideologies. And today, Juliette will talk to us about Lord Cromer and Egyptian nationalism. Of course, the key part of our theme that we've been looking through in the first third of this year, exploring the centenary of Egyptian independence from British rule in 1922, and what that really meant to Egypt, to Britain, and of course, to Egyptology. So I'm really delighted to be joined today by Juliette. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks for having me. That's great. It has, writing this lecture has enabled me to revisit themes that I'd explored during my PhD a long time ago. So that was really quite nice. So Evelyn Baring, better known as Lord Cromer, embodied British rule over Egypt for over 20 years. And the reason I want to talk about him today is that although he left Egypt long before 1922, of course, Lord Cromer's misreading of Egyptian nationalist sentiment and the autocratic tendencies of his regime put Egypt firmly on the road to independence, or at least I think so. So I'll talk really about momentous events which resonated deeply with the Egyptian nationalist movements, the military campaign in the Sudan and above all the Fashoda incident, the signing of the Entente Cordiale with France, and the Denshawai incident. And you'll see how the same errors of judgment were made and eventually caused the fall of Lord Cromer. So a few words about the man first. I'm going to call him Cromer throughout this paper for practical reason, but obviously he only became Lord Cromer in 1901. Anyway, Cromer was a military man, and this is his service records, or a summary of military records that we've got here at the National Archives. He graduated from the Royal Military Academy at 17 and was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Royal Artillery in 1858. He was initially posted to a battery in Corfu, where he learned modern and ancient Greek as well as Italian, and became aide-de-camp to the British High Commissioner, Henry Stokes. After the union of the Ionian Islands with Greece, Cromer followed the High Commissioner to Malta, still as his aide-de-camp. He then attended the Army Staff College and spent 2 years at the War Office. In 1872, he went to India as private secretary to his cousin, Lord Northbrook, the Viceroy of India. And that's where he developed a passion for administration, if there is such a thing as a passion for administration. He returned to England in 1876 and resigned from the army in 1877. So Cromer first arrived in Egypt in 1877 as the British representative to the Caisse de la Dette Publique, which had been set up the year before to monitor Egyptian finances. And I won't dwell on this too much, but for the first time in his career, he was pretty much left to his own device. Since I've been here, he wrote to Goshen, I've led rather than followed. And considering the interests I represent, I think I should continue to do so. So now fast forward 2 years, in 1879, Cromer was back in London and was offered the post of Controller General in Egypt. According to Frank Lascelles, who was the Consul General in Egypt, the design was that he should be practically Minister of Finance. Writing to Lascelles on the 2nd of July, 1879, Cromer said, "You bad man, I hate the idea of going to Egypt again, but evidently I must go." So he went. In 1880, however, he decided to accompany the new Viceroy of India, the Marquis of Ripon, and that's him here, to serve in his council. In 1882, while he was in India, Britain invaded Egypt, and then this is a photo of Alexandria after the bombardment. Britain invaded Egypt in response to a nationalist revolt led by Ahmed Rabi. In 1883, Cromer was offered the post of agent and consul general in Cairo. And his initial frame of mind is interesting. In a memo written in September 1882, so before he even got there, he stated that he was strongly opposed to the establishment of a protectorate. And he wrote, "I do not see what the Egyptians, considered as a nation, have done to forfeit their right to self-government." His role was to advise the Khedive, reform the administration, improve the justice system, and to make sure really that military occupation would be as short as possible. He got very few instructions from the foreign secretary, and he was, as before, more or less left to his own device. And that's when he started really to govern Egypt. His initial appraisal of the situation in Egypt changed rather rapidly. In the space of a few years, he'd become convinced that a quick evacuation wasn't possible and that more reforms were absolutely necessary. And he spent the next 15 years asserting British control over all aspects of Egypt's administration. So now, if you'll allow me to fast forward again to the first of these momentous events I was talking about at the start, and to the Fashoda crisis, David Lewis wrote that despite repeated promises, the British settled down to a permanent Egyptian occupation. The French settled into a mood of permanent rage. Bit harsh, perhaps, but probably not very far from the truth. Between 1896 and 1898, France and Britain raced to be the first to reach Fashoda, south of Khartoum. The French mission, led by Captain Marchand, left from French West Africa and crossed the continent eastwards, while British troops, led by Kitchener, were reconquering the Sudan, which had been an Egyptian province in the past. So when Marchand and Kitchener met in Fashoda, and this is Fashoda here, when they met in Fashoda in September 1898, France and Britain almost went to war, and this had a massive impact on Egyptian nationalism because France had to cave in. The convention signed in June 1898, and then the establishment of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium over the Sudan in 1899, meant that France was giving up on Egypt and on the whole Nile region. Britain was now occupying Sudan as well, under a condominium in which Egypt wasn't playing much of a role. And this left Egyptian nationalists completely disillusioned. Egyptian nationalism had been completely stifled after the defeat of the nationalist troops in Tel Kebir in 1882, mostly because Britain and Lord Cromer in particular had been unable or unwilling to recognize that a nationalist movement could combine anti-Western ideas through maybe pan-Islamism with liberal ideas inspired by the West, and especially the concept of constitutionalism. In 1882, Georges Clemenceau in France had declared that there wasn't yet such a thing as an Egyptian nationality. But from the moment Britain invaded Egypt, France was very supportive of Egyptian nationalists who were, above all, trying to prevent Britain to completely dominate the country. The French failure or defeat at Fashoda forced the nationalists to reconsider their support lines and, in a way, to reinvent themselves. France was clearly not prepared to go to war with Britain, nor even to reopen the Egyptian question. The national movement, led by young lawyer Mustafa Kemal, and that's him here, had tried to play on the Anglo-French rivalry and found many supporters in Anglophobe Parisian circles. After the French capitulation at Fashoda and the reassertion of British power, Egyptian nationalists had to turn to the Ottoman Empire and to some extent to pan-Islamism. After all, Egypt was still technically an Ottoman province. During this period, and despite Mustafa Kemal's efforts, The Egyptians also failed to reclaim their national history and archaeological heritage, over which France and Britain were fighting more fiercely than ever. Kemal acknowledged France had played a role in the rediscovery of ancient Egypt and the efforts of French savants to trigger interest in the country. And it wasn't all bad. Cromer, for instance, was often spoke in favor of antiquities remaining in the country. But it couldn't be ignored that between 1882 and 1904, France did everything it could to colonize archaeology. The development of British archaeology, encouraged to some extent by Cromer, had perhaps sometimes almost threatened the French monopoly, but the Bonaparte, Champollion, Mariette, Holy Trinity really remained a symbol of French influence on the banks of the Nile, a symbol that France was not prepared to cede to what was perceived as the nationalist threat. Cromer seized this perfect opportunity, and he wrote, "Has not the time almost arrived when we might tell the French that the constant heckling we have to endure from them in Egypt will no longer be tolerated?" And that all of this led to the signature of the Entente Cordiale on the 8th of April, 1904. By sending the Marchand mission, France had tried to force Britain to reopen the Egyptian question and to leave the country, but only managed to consolidate British presence and power in Egypt. The Fashoda crisis marked a turning point in the perception and the direction of both powers' colonial policies. They were now leaning towards consolidation rather than conquest. The cornerstone of French foreign policy had long been the alliance with the Russian Empire, but an alliance with Britain now seemed logical. The agreements signed in London on the 8th of April 1904 covered every single dispute between France and Britain, from Newfoundland to Siam. But the most important one was undoubtedly the declaration on Egypt and Morocco, which led France to almost completely disappear from the Egyptian political landscape, but reasserted the French archaeological monopoly. The Entente Cordiale had many heavy consequences in Egypt. The French public was rather sentimentally attached to Egypt, and the French press provided a great platform to nationalist ideas. But the second paragraph of this declaration on Egypt and Morocco stated, "The government of the French Republic, for their part, declare that they will not obstruct the action of Great Britain in Egypt." If Fashoda hadn't made it clear enough, it was now obvious that the nationalists couldn't count on the usual French support. The concept of a nation wasn't very prevalent in Egypt at the time. Egyptian people tended to self-define according to religious or ethnic criteria. Muslims, Copts, Turks, Circassians, Fellahin. And then this came from the heteroclite nature of Egyptian society. From the beginning of the 20th century, however, the Egyptians started to demand to be part of the construction of the Egyptian nation, which obviously meant that they had to conceptualize national identity in a more focused way to find solid ground on which national independence could be established. And deprived of the long-standing French support, they had to find this solid ground elsewhere. The nationalist movements did flirt with pan-Islamism, but eventually opted for an Egyptian-centered form of nationalism. They created political parties along those lines and started relying on the pharaonic past to justify independence and rally the nation. The third paragraph of Article 1 of the Entente Cordiale stated, "It is agreed that the post of Director General of Antiquities in Egypt shall continue as in the past to be entrusted to a French savant." So through Egyptology, France still had influence in Egypt, but by creating such a formal monopoly and entrenched in a treaty, France became a colonialist nation which hadn't quite given up on its role in Egypt. And this was perceived as a betrayal by the nationalists, and most particularly by Mustafa Kemal, whom Cromer had nicknamed the Gallicized Egyptian. Kemal later wrote, "Today, my fellow countrymen hate France as much as England." He's, as I said, after the signature of the Entente Cordiale, the nationalist movements flirted with pan-Islamism. The Sultan even granted Kemal the title of Pasha, and this caused a breakdown between the movement and the Khedive, who feared that it might jeopardize the de facto independence of Egypt from Constantinople. And the Khedive started growing sort of closer to British positions and oppose any form of nationalism. Just like after Fashoda, the Entente Cordiale forced the nationalists to reconsider their positions, or rather the ways in which they were expressed. The ideological breakup of the Khedive, for instance, caused them to champion a liberal and parliamentarian constitution. Now, Egypt was no longer an obstacle to good Anglo-French relations, but it did remain a bit of a headache for Britain, who was increasingly vilified by the nationalists, even though, to be completely fair, Cromer's administrative and financial reforms were not all bad. It became increasingly difficult for the British to keep the Egyptian sense of national identity at bay, and the French withdrawal from the political scene gave the nationalists a new impetus, a new essentially Egyptian impetus. And this leads us to the last, I think the most important of our momentous events. So I'll spend a bit more time talking about it. The 1906 Denshawai incident showed how tense the relations were between the Egyptians and the British, and how easily the situation could escalate. The very disputable verdict handed down by the special tribunal and the disproportionately severe sentences triggered nationalist feelings throughout the country, which showed to the British authorities that, contrary to what they thought, a patriotic movement did exist in Egypt and it was ready to grow. So on the 13th of June 1906, 5 officers from the British Army of Occupation, Major Pinecoffin, Captain Bull, Lieutenants Porter and Smithick, and Dr. Bostock, went to the village of Denshawai, near Tanta in the delta of the Nile, to shoot pigeons. Pigeon shooting was one of the British community's favorite hobbies. Pigeons were bred by the Egyptians, so shooting was very strictly regulated, and no one could shoot pigeons without an official invitation from the Omde, which is roughly the equivalent of a mayor, or from another important local personality. Having apparently received such an invitation, the officers went their separate ways. Pinecoffin, Bull and Smithick went north, Porter and Bostock went south, a few hundred meters from the threshing floors. Lieutenant Porter had just started shooting when a fire broke out in one of the threshing floors. Its owner, Mohammed Abdel Nabi Muazzin, grabbed Porter's weapon and they wrestled, and the gun went off and a woman was killed. Pinecoffin, Bull and Smithick rushed towards them, noted, because they must have been so perceptive, that an angry mob was closing down on them, and they decided to hand over their weapons and their watches to try to deflate the situation. They then pretended to arrest Porter, and they were walking towards their carriages when they were attacked by the villagers with sticks and stones, and they were surrounded and taken prisoners. Bull had received a rather nasty whack on the head, but he did manage to escape, and he was ordered by Pinecoffin to seek help at the base camp in Hamshish, about 10 kilometers from Denshawai. Unfortunately, he died on the way. The officers were eventually rescued, and they were back in Hamshish about 2 hours after it all started, and they were all severely wounded. So that this is basically what happened on that day, according to witness statements, which I hasten to say are not necessarily trustworthy, because the statements were mostly made by the British officers. Back in 1895, because the number of aggressions against members of the British Army of Occupation was increasing, a special tribunal was created to judge cases involving Egyptians and officers or soldiers of the Army of Occupation. And it was explicitly created to impose severer punishments than regular tribunals, and to avoid misjudgments by replacing martial courts. This special tribunal had rather peculiar rules. There was no right to appeal. Sentences were to be implemented immediately. It followed the principles and precepts of Egyptian law, but it could inflict sentences which didn't exist or no longer existed under the Egyptian criminal law. And it could only be formed at the request of the British representative in Egypt. So a special tribunal was formed on the 17th of June 1906. It was presided over by Boutros Ghali, the interim Minister of Justice, but it was mostly British. The only other Egyptian member was the president of Cairo's native tribunal, Ahmed Bey Fatih Zahlul. After a very short preliminary inquiry, the tribunal gathered for the first time on the 24th of June 1906 to judge 52 defendants. Witnesses gave evidence for 3 days, at the end of which the verdict was handed down. And it read, "The incident is considered as homicide, preceded, accompanied, or followed by the crime of robbery with violence. This crime was committed intentionally and with premeditation." Now, according to Article 198 of the Egyptian Penal Code, the mere fact that the homicide had been accompanied by robbery with violence was enough to sentence the defendants to death. The trial only lasted 3 days. The 52 defendants only had 30 minutes to defend themselves, and the bulk of the evidence was presented by the British officers. It's not surprising that many very grey areas remain, and that questions can be raised. Some of these questions were actually raised in Parliament during the preliminary inquiry, while others were ignored. The first question is the matter of uniforms, and it's an important one because it was at the very basis of the legality of the special tribunal. This special tribunal could only be constituted if the soldiers were in uniform in the execution of their duty. So the question was raised in the House of Commons very early on, and it was quickly determined that the 5 officers were indeed in uniform and sporting the insignia of their respective units. From a British point of view, it was therefore obvious that the villagers were aware of their status as officers of the Army of Occupation. And then this, I think, is extremely debatable because khaki clothes and pith helmets were very popular amongst Europeans in the summer, and it's most unlikely that the inhabitants of Denshawai could recognize the insignia. The second issue is that of premeditation. On the 19th of June 1906, Lord Cromer wrote to Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, and said, "Everything leads us to conclude that the attack was prepared beforehand." Now, according to the Egyptian Criminal Code, premeditation wasn't a requisite for the death penalty to be considered. And this question will probably remain unsolved. I mean, if some facts seem to tip the scale towards premeditation, logic really says otherwise. On the one hand, the officers had obtained permission to shoot pigeons around Denshawai from the local authorities, so it was known that they would be there on that day. besides, according to Lieutenant Porter's testimony, which is obviously partial and shouldn't be taken literally, so with a massive pinch of salt, there were no children to be seen, which does seem or did seem unusual in a village in the middle of the day. And then, and this was the argument really retained by the tribunal, the fire in the threshing floor area, which causes remained uncertain, might have been a signal. Porter and Bostock, who were the closest officers, were at least 200 meters from the threshing floor, and they were shooting at flying pigeons. So from such a distance and without shooting directly at the grain, it seems unlikely that they could have started a fire. On the other hand, if the villagers knew that the 5 men served with the army of occupation, they would have known that retaliation would be brutal, and that in the unlikely event of clemency from the military authorities, the government would be quite uncompromising. And then the tribunal ruled that the incident was considered as homicide, preceded, accompanied, or followed by the crime of robbery with violence, and that it was committed intentionally and with premeditation. But it's quite clear that the death of Captain Bull, on which public opinion focused both in Britain and in Egypt, was absolutely unintentional. Charles Findlay, Cromer's deputy, described the captain's death as a brutal and premeditated murder, but he left the village alive, and according to Bostock testimony, his death had been the result of concussion of the brain and of a sunstroke. So, I mean, his death was tragic, of course, but it was probably nothing more than a tragic accident. Now, despite all these grey areas, the special tribunal had been created, as I said earlier, to inflict several punishments, and the sentences passed on the 27th of June 1906 were extremely severe indeed. The tribunal declared that these prisoners deserved no mercy, as they had showed no mercy. So out of 52 defendants, 21 were sentenced, 4 to death by hanging on the main square at Denshawai, 2 to penal servitude for life, 1 to 15 years penal servitude, 6 to 7 years penal servitude, 3 to 1 year's imprisonment with hard labour and 50 lashes at Denshawai, and 5 to 50 lashes at Denshawai. These sentences were executed on the 28th of June 1906 in public. According to Mitchell, who was the advisor to the Ministry of the Interior, it all passed off quietly. One of the prisoners wasn't actually flogged due to his health, which apparently proved the sentences were not carried out in an inhuman or vindictive spirit. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ottoman courbash, which Lord Cromer himself had forbidden in Egypt in 1884, but it's made of extremely hard leather and very often sports little metal claws at the end of each strand of leather. So there is nothing that is not inhuman or vindictive in spirit in the use of the courbash. The British authorities justified these sentences by claiming that the villagers had organized the attack, and that they had done so because they were fanatics, that fanaticism was developing throughout Egypt and that it had to be rooted out for order to be maintained. And even the French Consul General in Cairo thought that fanaticism explained the I quote, extraordinary savagery with which the Fellaheen had defended their pigeons. So admittedly, the press, and in particular the Liwa, the paper run by Mustafa Kemal, was overwhelmingly negative, and the British government in London may have been entitled to think, like Cromer, that the situation in Egypt was very disquieting. However, the reaction of the inhabitants of Denshawai could not be blamed on nationalist unrest, I think. nationalist unrest at the time mostly existed amongst the intellectual elite. And besides, the inhabitants of Denshawai were probably all illiterate and therefore couldn't have been affected by the rather inflammatory rhetoric of the Cairo and Alexandria newspapers. Now, also, given the large indifference to Islam amongst the Egyptian youth, especially among students, the accusation of fanaticism was rather weak. I mean, there was an increase in the use of religious rhetoric, but only after the Denshawai sentences were executed. The French military attaché in London noted, there is no fanaticism in Egypt, but only a grim determination to kick the British out. This is not fanaticism, this is patriotism. The Denshawai incident very quickly occupied a prime position in the Egyptian nationalist martyrology. The excessive and medieval sentences handed down by the Special Tribunal and the use of the Kourbash crystallized nationalist feelings. By making an example of Denshawai, the British had tried to reassert their control over Egypt, but in reality, after Denshawai, the national movement gained the support of all those who'd been hesitating so far. According to John Marlowe, left to themselves, it would probably not have occurred to the nationalist leaders to make very much of an issue about the hanging and flogging of a few peasants. I mean, it is true that the nationalist leader took great advantage of the indignation of the British public opinion, conveyed in particular by the Manchester Guardian. It is also true that he drew extensively on the arguments debated at the House of Commons, and especially on those raised by John Robertson, the MP for Tyneside. He even paid tribute to them in an article that he published in the Figaro, French newspaper, on the 11th of July 1906, entitled "To the British Nation and the Civilized World," writing that he felt, I quote, "sincere admiration and gratitude towards the British writers and MPs who'd expressed their horror at the sinister tragedy unfolding in Egypt." However, it is more than likely that the nationalist movement would have turned the Denshawai incident into a constituent element of the Egyptian collective identity all the same. The notion of nation still wasn't very widespread in Egypt, and this incident, which was for the nationalists a tangible sign of British despotism, was the ideal foundation for Egyptian nationalist and patriotic feelings. The Denshawai incident and the way in which it was debated in the House of Commons led to the resignation of the man who'd been the man on the spot for 24 years. Lord Cromer, agent and consul general, resigned on the 28th of March 1907. The nationalists, and more especially Mustafa Kemal, saw his departure as, I quote, "a national triumph," and the proof that he was directly and personally responsible for the Denshawai atrocities. Now, for some of his contemporaries, such as Wilfrid Blunt or Robertson, Cromer was entirely responsible for the severity of the sentences and the brutality with which they had been executed. Others, like Edward Grey, thought that as he hadn't been in Egypt during the trial, he couldn't quite be held responsible. Now, Cromer was behind the creation of the Special Tribunal in 1895. He was worried about anti-British feelings in Egypt, and he was convinced that the solution was to be firmer. He requested the constitution of the Special Tribunal himself right after the incident. So it is quite clear that Cromer did want to make an example of Denshawai to avoid similar troubles and to reassert British authority over the country. However, he'd left Egypt before the trial, and he left his deputy, Charles Findlay, in charge of current affairs. And there's nothing in official papers, I mean, nothing that I could find anyway, which may lead to think that he was even consulted on trial or the sentences or their execution after he left for Britain. so that made some people think that the verdict of the court was the result of, I quote, an inept and barbaric interpretation by Cromer's subordinates of what they considered his policy to be. According to Edward Grey, quote, if he'd had any notion that such things might happen, he would never have left Egypt before the trial was over. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't particularly like Lord Cromer as an historical character, but it is almost certain that if he'd stayed in Egypt, he would have made sure that cooler heads prevailed. And it's even more certain that he wouldn't have turned the executions into the very tasteless performance orchestrated by Matchell and Finlay. So Cromer officially resigned for health reasons and not for political considerations linked to Denshawai. And he asked Grey to make this very clear to the cabinet and at the House of Commons, and to state that Britain would maintain the policy which he had inspired in Egypt. This being said, the Foreign Office as a whole, and Edward Grey in particular, must have been quite relieved when Cromer decided to step down. And in the first few months that followed his resignation, he did exchange letters with Eldon Gorst, who'd replaced him. But from then on, he was never, ever consulted by the Foreign Office, either officially or unofficially, on Egyptian affairs, which seems a bit weird after having ruled the country for 24 years. So that gives you an idea of how Whitehall perceived the man. And the Denshawai incident kept haunting Cromer after his resignation. The House of Commons grappled long and hard with the possibility of allotting him £50,000 in recognition of his eminent services as agent and consul general in Egypt. Basically, the government thought that his pension was inadequate in the face of the services rendered. And you have to remember that Cromer had governed Egypt for almost a quarter of a century with all the responsibilities he had entailed, but he was only agent and consul general, not even ambassador. And his pension, which amounted to £900 a month, it was quite a lot of money at the time, but it did seem not very much when compared with the work he'd done and the pressure he'd endured. Rather than readjusting the pension, though, the government allotted him a large sum of money as special recognition. But a lot of people spoke against this for various reasons. The legitimacy of such a grant was challenged, and the legitimacy of Britain's occupation of Egypt was also challenged during the debate. Some MPs thought that it was absolutely absurd to reward Cromer, given that, I quote, instead of carrying the policy of evacuation, which he was ordered to do, he'd made Egypt into a British province. And then besides, from a strictly financial point of view, some MPs thought that if Cromer had to be rewarded, the money should be paid to him from Egyptian sources, because the service rendered had been rendered to Egypt and not to the British taxpayers, given Egypt wasn't a British colony. In the end, even though Grey declared that the Denshawai incident was irrelevant to this particular vote, the MPs opposed to the motion made it the cornerstone of their arguments. And the £50,000 were eventually granted to Cromer, but he remained, in the words of Redmond, the MP for Clare East, I quote, a gentleman whose name would forever be connected to what was a blot and a disgrace on the name of the British Empire. So the Denshawai incident had heavy consequences. It could have been little more than yet another manifestation of the enmity prevailing between the Egyptians and the British, but the rather disproportionate reaction of the British authorities enabled the nationalists to turn it into a constituent element of a collective awareness of a patriotic sense of national identity, a sense of national identity and national pride, which strength Cromer and other British officials in Egypt completely missed, or chose to ignore. In January 1907, an Egyptian wrote to Edward Grey saying, in Egypt, government is illegally run by a single man, Cromer, who owes his power to nothing but absolutism. His power is limitless. The state, it is him. And Denshawai really broke the spell. So Denshawai wasn't exactly the catalyst of a unified nationalism. It triggered the creation of various very different movements and parties, but it did have one remarkable consequence, apart from the fall of Lord Cromer, the institutionalization of nationalism, with the ultimate goal to get Egypt back to the Egyptian, and with the famous slogan, misreading. Thank you for listening. Carl, back to you.
Thank you so much for that, Juliette. That was really fascinating. And I think I agree with you. I don't know anyone who could have a passion for administration, but we could all try.
Well, not me, and I'm a civil servant.
Thanks so much. That was really fascinating. Just this idea that the concept of an Egyptian nation was sort of partly born out of a shared trauma, really, I suppose, in many ways. So I'm just going to stop the recording